of Christine Simmons-Moore's talk from last year's Education Day. Christine will not be able to join us today for Q&A. Instead, we're going to have something called a reverse Q&A. Christine has prepared a slide of questions that we're going to invite you to go to the social lounge to discuss among yourselves. And so please do reserve your questions for this session. Now, Professor Christine Simmons-Moore is in the psychology department at the University of West Georgia. Her research interests include the study of personality types who are prone to subjective, anomalous, and paranormal experiences and beliefs, transpersonal experiences, the overlaps between parapsychology and clinical psychology, cognitive and neurobiological correlates of paranormal experiences, synesthesia and anomalous experiences, and how sleep-related and other altered states of consciousness relate to subjective anomalous experiences. She is editor of the book Exceptional Experience and Health, Essays on Mind, Body, and Human Potential. She is a co-author of a textbook on anomalistic psychology, and she is working on a book about the psychology and parapsychology of ghosts. And here is Christine's talk.
Day and talk to you a little bit about research and discoveries into extrasensory perception and how they can be informed actually by psychology. Because I see parapsychology and psychology as being intimately connected, and they have a lot to say to each other. So as John pointed out, a lot of my own research has focused on the psychology of paranormal experiences. And actually, I started out by researching extrasensory perception when I did my PhD, which was actually in the UK under Chris Rowe at the University of Northampton. So yeah, I find it fascinating, and I'm going to share a little bit about what that is, first of all, and a little bit about the correlates of experiences, and then a little bit more about what we have learned in parapsychology about actual extrasensory perception. Like, does it happen? When does it happen? Who does it happen to? So hopefully this will give you a nice overview. And yes, as John pointed out, you can study parapsychology at UWG. So I'll give a bit of a nudge to that. And actually I see one of our PhD students is in this room today. So hello, Nancy. Nancy's actually doing her PhD work on a parapsychological topic. So yeah, she's here. She can give you a first person insight into what that's like. So moving on, maybe, or maybe not. All right, my computer's frozen, so hold on 1 second. Technical issues.
Christine, do you want to?
It's working. It's just slow. I don't know. We'll just have to let it do its thing. It's probably something to do with PK. All right, so Annalisa gave a really good overview of parapsychology, and she included a nice intro into research approaches into extrasensory perception, but I'm going to go back and talk about what this is again, just to make sure everybody's clear about what we're talking about. And maybe you'll realize that you've had one of these experiences yourself, because even if you're skeptical, it's often the case that you or a family member has had something like this happen to them. So we're talking about experiences that seem to be involving information access that shouldn't happen. So basically, information seems to be acquired without the use of the normal senses. And this includes what's known as telepathy and telesthesia. I'll talk about that in a minute. Precognition, clairvoyance, and retrocognition. So telepathy is where people have awareness of what another person is thinking or feeling. And it can sometimes be very embodied. So this is particularly noted in twin experiences, for example, and that's actually been studied in terms of subjective experiences and in psi performance in Sweden. So this is the idea that sometimes twins can have embodied experiences. So they might have a feeling of pain in their body that seems to relate to the pain that their twin is going through at a distant location. So that's fascinating. And that's something we'll come back to later, the idea of the body being really, really important in ESP. So it can be mental, but it can also be very, very physical. Precognition, as depicted on the slide, Professor Trelawney, any Harry Potter fans here will recognize her. She is gazing into a crystal ball. In the movies, you'll see her also looking into tea leaves and divining aspects of the future. So any experience where people have access to the future is known as precognition. This often happens in the dream state, but can also happen in the waking state. Clairvoyance is basically clear seeing, but it can also be clairaudience, where people might hear information, or clairsentience, where they might feel information. But basically, information is happening at a distance. So, for example, it might be the case that somebody like Edgar Casey, who's on the slide, was able to have direct awareness of something that was going on at a distance. So I think he was reported to be able to read a thermometer of a person who was in a different location. And that is an example of a clairvoyant experience. So of course, we don't know whether these experiences are actually suggestive of actual psi, because they're subjective experiences, but they're very, very interesting, and they give us clues really with regard to what might actually be going on in terms of actual ESP. So there's another one on the slide here, retrocognition, that is very, very neglected in the research, but it's interesting. This is where people have apparent experiences of the past. And so the example I often use here is where people might go to a battlefield that's, currently not a battlefield. So I've been to the battlefields in Belgium and France. They're very, very peaceful areas. But some people have reported things like flashes of the past that seem to be related to things that actually happened in the past. So that's awareness of information from the past. That's harder to test in the lab, but it's still a very interesting and valid experience. So I'm going to try and go forward again. Okay, it's working now. Excellent. So why do we study these experiences? I have to justify my existence a lot of the time, but this is what I say. I say these experiences are something that's fairly common. Psychologists study schizophrenia, for example, that happens in 1% of the population. Now, subjective paranormal experiences happen in many more members of the population. And when we're talking about extrasensory experiences, this is actually one of the most common types of paranormal phenomena, paranormal experience, I should say. So a study by John Palmer found about 39% of a sample, general population sample, reported having had a psychic experience. So this is quite high. This is a significant subset of the population. These experiences are reported throughout history as well, and appear in different cultures. So even if they're sort of packaged up differently, which they really are, you see very similar core elements to experiences, but they might be sort of understood differently and embraced differently, actually. So particularly US versus Brazil. Brazil, you've got lots of embracing of these experiences, whereas in America, not as much. Anyway, they're still there. They're very, very, very much part of the human experience, and we have to study them. It's really, really important as psychologists and parapsychologists really to know what might be going on. So I've got a quote from Caroline Watt here, who is the Kersler Chair of Parapsychology in Edinburgh. And that's like the main centre for parapsychology, I suppose, in the UK. And she said, even if it turns out that paranormal phenomena can be explained by normal mechanisms, because many people have experiences which they interpret as paranormal, scientists have a responsibility to understand them. And I absolutely agree with that. But they also have something to tell us about consciousness itself. So if these experiences are genuine, this really suggests that something else might be going on in terms of how we understand how the mind works. If minds can actually access information that other people are experiencing, if minds can access information at a distance, and if minds can actually access future or past information. That's really, really interesting, and we need to pay attention to that. So when do these experiences happen and for whom? So a lot of my research, as John pointed out, is focused on psychology. I'm really interested in the correlates of experiences in particular, and we'll talk a lot about that today. So these experiences tend to have some commonalities, and they tend to occur in altered states of consciousness. So again, we're talking about subjective experiences now, but you'll recognize some overlap with actual psi performance when I talk about that a little bit later as well. So yes, they can happen spontaneously or they can happen intentionally. In terms of spontaneous experiences, they really do tend to occur when people are in these liminal states, so in between states of consciousness, And I've used a term from the SPR Phantasms of the Living, borderland. The borderland states between wakefulness and sleep, and also during dreams. These are really rich times for extrasensory experiences. Incidentally, they're also really common times for other types of paranormal phenomena as well. They happen often between people who have a close emotional bond. And actually, there is some research, not enough actually, but some research that finds that these experiences tend to run in families. But if you talk to people about this, this is a thing. They often occur in association with meaningful and emotional events. So people will often report having awareness that somebody might be about to die, for example. And then near-death experiences are very interesting for many reasons, but people who have near-death experiences often come back and they will then have more extrasensory experiences as a result of them. And then tragic experiences are often reported in precognition. So again, these are experiences that people have of the future. So many experiences happen between those who are biologically related, and that's also borne out in actual ESP experiments too. And there is some interesting research that finds that certain people tend to report these experiences more than others. And these people I refer to as anomaly-prone personality types. So what I've talked about and other people have talked about is this idea of interactions between sort of trait and state anomaly proneness. So essentially, you've got people who are sort of wired to be more interconnected with themselves, more likely to be able to shift into different states of consciousness, more likely to have more influence from the body into their mind, more awareness of unconscious, usually unconscious aspects of reality. They're wired that way. Some people will not have many of these experiences in their lives, but they might have them in association with certain states of consciousness. And then you can also look at these things together. So the idea that trait anomaly prone people might be more likely to dip into interesting states of consciousness. So when we talk about state anomaly proneness, I'm really talking about states of consciousness that are liminal. You're in between. You've got more awareness of yourself. You've got more access to your unconscious mind, and potentially a wider understanding of unconsciousness, I should say, like a Jungian idea, I suppose. So liminal states are associated with falling asleep and waking up from sleep, which is called hypnagogia and hypnopompia. Sleep paralysis is a liminal state. It's interesting because you're sort of asleep but awake at the same time. Lucid dreaming, another really interesting state. You're asleep but awake at the same time. And then other altered states of consciousness, including meditation that is more intentional, and psychedelic states. So a lot of subjective paranormal experiences, particularly of the extrasensory variety, have been reported in psychedelic states. And so David Luke's work has really focused on that recently. And then meditators do seem to report a lot of psychic experiences as well. And actually there's evidence that the brain might change to be more interconnected with itself when people are more consistent meditators, I should say. But there is an interaction between these things as well. So a lot of the personality variables on the left, these are new words, I know, but I'm just going to say it's about the picture in the middle. So it's about the picture at the bottom, I suppose. So people who are boundary thin, transliminal, who score higher on measures of positive schizotypy, they're much more fluid. Everything's a bit more connected, more creative, more open. And so that's really sort of the best way to describe it, an openness and a tendency towards more associational thinking. Synesthesia is one of my pet projects, and I've been doing a lot of my recent research on that, and that is also characterized by having a mind and brain that's more interconnected. But synesthetes also have different ways of experiencing the world that I think can lend some clues into these experiences. So they have colors, for example, in addition to just seeing a letter on a page. They have an extra way of seeing the world. So again, it's about connectivity, which is the theme of this conference. So connectivity is key to extrasensory experiences. I just wanted to show you this too, because I think this is really interesting. And this is going back to Louisa Rhine's work. So I know this is co-sponsored by the Rhine. So Louisa Rhine was J.B. Rhine's wife, and she was really interested in experiences and the patterns in experiences. And what she noticed was interesting patterns with the state of consciousness and the type of ESP, and also time. So remember, we talked about ESP happening in real time, in the future, but also the past. Here she's just got a comparison between precognition and real-time ESP, but you've got different types of ESP happening too. So some people just get a gut feeling, which is the intuitive, and that's associated more with the waking state, and real-time psi impressions. Hallucinatory ESP is where the ESP experiences seem to mimic your senses, and that happens more in real time, but also in the waking state. Realistic dreams tend to be precognitive, which is really interesting, as if things are sort of playing out as they will play out in the future, at least in terms of subjective experiences. So 60% of those in her study were precognitive. And then unrealistic dreams are pretty similar, but slightly more in real time. That's where you've got sort of metaphors happening in dreams. So I just think that's really interesting, and it's very, very understudied. And I think we need to go back to those kind of patternings to understand more about ESP as well. All right, so before we dive into some actual parapsychological findings, there are some normal explanations we need to think about. And this is part and parcel of parapsychology, honestly. It's really important to know what looks like psi but isn't. And this is a Bob Morris quote. He was a professor of parapsychology, very influential on my own journey into parapsychology. So really important to know what looks like psi but isn't, and to be able to try and rule that out or be aware of that. Or that, you know, sometimes parapsychological experiences are a bit of both. They might be a little bit of normal and a bit of paranormal, or sometimes they might be just all normal. And so it's really important to do some experiments to work out, you know, what might really be going on. But anyway, so just to whet your appetite, there does seem to be evidence that people who are anomaly prone are sometimes more able to be more sensitive to the world. They're more sensitive to information that's actually present. And then it's misperceived as ESP. And so we found some evidence of that in our own research with synesthesia. Meaning making. There is a tendency to see shapes and causality in randomness. So one way to think about this in everyday experience is looking at clouds. And I play this a lot with my son, and it's fun, and it's about creativity too. So you're looking at the shape of the clouds, and you're trying to sort of see patterns in the clouds. And people who are more likely to sort of have more complicated shapes and randomness, that tendency does relate to paranormal experiences too. And that's not to discount them. I've actually done some research to try and look at that tendency with the idea that sometimes people will pick up the psi information as well as being creative, as well as the idea that, oh, they're just seeing things that aren't there. I think it's more complex than that. And also the idea that sometimes skeptical people might miss a signal sometimes. That's what I've looked at too. But there is a relationship there. So people who are more likely to see meaning will be more likely to have ESP experiences. There's actually, interestingly, a greater tendency to perceive minds. So human beings, part of being human, to have the understanding that other people have intentionality and they have thoughts and beliefs. And so there's some evidence that believers and experiencers will see minds in more places. And so that's illustrated on my slide, where I've got a nice picture of a rock. That's also apophenia, or the type 1 error, but it's also that we see faces. We tend to see faces everywhere. We perceive that there are thoughts and intentions where there are not sometimes. And there's also the idea that people might misattribute information that's subliminal and happening outside of your focus of attention as psychic information. So we've got to try and look at those and rule some of those things out in experiments to sort of see what might really be going on. But again, I like to say, well, sometimes the psi might hook into some of these things. And actually, Nicola Holt and myself have looked at the idea that psi might work like the unattended stimulus and be filtered out of attention. And Jim Carpenter's model of psi, talks about psi as first sight, happening before subliminal perception. So I think the best way to move forward is both and, but you have to be aware of the normal explanations in order to really make a good case, I think, for what might really be going on. So I think Annalisa talked about some of this in her really cool overview of parapsychology. But ESP in particular is studied in various ways. So we see research that's trying to prove that psi occurs. And so this is where researchers try to rule out normal explanations using probability and statistics. We look at process-oriented research, and that is really where a lot of my own work has focused. So understanding how it works, which factors correlate with actual ESP performance. Does it work better when people are relaxed versus very tense, for example? So what are the correlates of psi? And psi is an anomalous process of information transfer. So that's how parapsychologists approach things. They will say, okay, there might be an anomaly. We don't necessarily say it's something paranormal. We say it's an anomaly that needs to be understood. And we try to sort of replicate and then see if consistent patterns come out and try and theorize about what might be going on there. But you can get a lot of clues with regard to psi and ESP in particular by looking at the correlates. The third wing is looking at phenomenology, and this is really understanding what experiences are like. What is it like to have a given experience? And then you can also gain clues there. And then some studies will do what's called a mixed methods approach. And this is one of my favorites, where you try to approach ESP from multiple perspectives within the same study. So I've done this with synesthesia, for example, where I was looking to see whether synesthetes did better at ESP compared to controls. I also asked the people to describe what their experiences were like in their lives, to really sort of try and get a sense for the relationship perhaps between synesthesia and extrasensory perception. All right, so you can get these cards from the Rhine, I believe. I have some somewhere. I think I've got several sets somewhere. But this is a nice picture of the Xena cards, and this is the way that research was done into ESP in the early era, in the Rhine era, in the 1930s and up to the 60s. And this can still be done today. I've done research with forced choice myself. So we did some work at Liverpool, Hope, when I was there, and we had some fruit. We used fruit instead of these symbols. You had 5 fruits, and we actually got people to come into the room and interact with the fruit and smell the fruit to try and prime them. And then each person had their own randomized sheet that was then hidden between 2 blank sheets and in an envelope, and they had to try and determine the order of the cards that was randomly determined. So that was fun. And I was trying to sort of really increase the meaning, because these can be a bit boring if you're trying to sort of guess a sequence of cards. So what's more interesting is the free response type of study. And so this is an example I've used in the class. So it's technically not precognition. Technically, it's actually retrocognition or telepathy, because you might be reading my mind because I know what the target is. But it's a precognition example for you. And so this is what is used in the Ganzfeld, which is the classic paradigm for extrasensory perception research that Annalisa described to you earlier today. So in the Ganzfeld, you'd be in a mild altered state of consciousness, and you would be trying to describe your experiences as a sender is focusing on a particular target. That would be a real-time experiment. A precognition version of that, you might not find out, you might not have a sender, and you might just have the target that is revealed in the future. And that's what we're going to do here. So you would like close your eyes and you would write down your impressions. And then after you'd written down your impressions and shown these four possibilities, you would be looking to see which potential target related the most to your imagery. And then it would be designated a hit if you had more overlap with the target that actually was picked or is picked in the future, if that makes sense. So there's different ways of setting up ESP experiments depending on whether you're interested in general ESP or in telepathy designs or in precognition. But generally, it's really difficult to rule out the different types of ESP. So most studies will say, well, it's this kind of design. But we can still see whether people are able to pick up on a target differently from chance. And we can also look at the process-oriented approach here and really see which factors correlate best with success under these conditions. So take a few minutes and think about which of these might be the target, and I will reveal it in a second. Maybe you want to write it down just to make sure that we're controlling things. Okay. So if I was doing this, I would then select the target using a random process. There are some programs out there that will do that. You can also use Research Randomizer, which is quite handy, and it's free. I like free for research. And the target was this beautiful cardinal, which is very apt because these are everywhere in Georgia, and I think they're beautiful. So that kind of design is something that we're going to be taking up actually in our lab at UWG. We're going to be looking at ESP using a precognition design in the context of a float tank. So we've been talking a lot with Cal Cooper, who's done some research on ESP and floating at Northampton. And so we're going to be doing something like that, but ours is going to be precognition, something like we just did. So yeah, I'm excited about that. We had a really short, really small donation that we're using to pay for float sessions. And we're hoping to run that when we get back up and running in August and September. So what do we know about ESP? We actually do know quite a lot. And how am I doing for time, by the way? Am I okay? Hopefully I am. Hopefully if I'm talking too much.
You're about 25 minutes in.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm coming close to the end. Yeah, so what do we know about ESP? Well, this is a selection because actually this is extensive research, and it goes back to J.B. Rhine's work, like I said, in the 30s. And there are journals dedicated to parapsychological research and more recent journals that are emerging that are open to parapsychological research. So I think there's a lot out there, even though people don't always know that there's a lot out there, because not every university has access to the Journal of Parapsychology, for example. But anyway, here's my very short summary. ESP seems to be better associated with altered states of consciousness. So this definitely overlaps with what we saw in terms of people's subjective experiences. So dreams are conducive to ESP performance in the lab. Hypnagogic-like states are conducive to ESP in the lab. So we see this in the Gansfeld research again. There's been some other research on hypnosis, and hypnosis seems to be conducive to better performance at ESP. And this is, even with card guessing, which seems a little bit more boring, it seems to do something. A classic finding in parapsychology is that believers in ESP do better at ESP tasks. And actually as well, we've also got the parapsychological experiment effect, where you've got some experimenters that are more open to or really believing inside themselves, and they tend to get better results too, which I think is actually very intriguing and tells us something about the phenomenon itself. This is my pet topic as well. Some personality types can guess targets better than chance. I've only got a few up here. There are others. So creativity, I've got that one because that is something that has been consistently found in the Gansfeld, for example. Openness to experience, extroversion, and we've also got dissociation and some mixed findings actually with transliminality, which is one of the measures I was talking about earlier. But more research needs to be done. And what seems to be the case is that there might be interactions between people's personality and the state in terms of ESP as well as for subjective experiences, which I find fascinating. So in particular with the hypnosis study I was referring to earlier, which was, I think, Tresoldi and colleagues, they found an interaction between transliminality and hypnosis for ESP in their study. So we've got to get a bit more intricate in how we're looking at how things work together, I think. because ESP seems to be actually something like a recipe. ESP works better with targets that are emotionally evocative or changing a lot. The remote viewing work, and I know there's a talk later by Paul Smith about that, but research by Ed May has found that targets that have a lot of entropy seem to be really, really good in that set of studies. So for example, an explosion. So it's about change, things that are important that seem to work really, really well for ESP. There is some evidence that ESP information seems to register in the system, so in the biological system, and be better evaluated implicitly. So that means unconsciously. And this includes like in how we feel, in our mood, in our behavior, and how we move our bodies, but also in terms of biological correlates. So in terms of the, the activity of the nervous system and the brain. So there's lots of studies that do find that, and there's a really nice review in the most recent handbook of parapsychology that I know that Annalisa referred you to earlier. So I find that fascinating, so that psi might be there, but is not always noticed. And then conscious psi is probably a bit rarer, and that occurs when information takes a more strong and accessible form. So people who are good at imaging, makes sense then that people who are really good at imaging, like creative people and synesthetes, might have more ESP experiences. So I think that is fascinating. And actually with my research, I didn't find that synesthetes did better at ESP than controls. But then when I looked into what was going on, there were two different types of synesthetes. So some synesthetes have the additional way of experiencing in their mind's eye, and some out in space. And the ones that had the extra way of experiencing the world, the extra color in the mind's eye, they did well at the ESP task. So something intriguing going on there. And then some research that is quite old, but we just got published in the Journal of Parapsychology. We did find evidence that ESP seems to be filtered out of attention, and people who are more liminal, you can see more evidence of that going on. So again, something like transliminality seems to be related to being able to filter psi out of attention. So I had a couple more slides just really to say I think that it's a recipe. You saw a lot of factors on that previous slide, and life isn't just one thing. You've got to think about how things are working together. So it's a system. I really think it's psi, ESP works as a system. It's relational. There's more than one person involved. Some people are more prone to having these experiences than others. Some people are more likely to perhaps access the states in experiments than others. And then other people might have these experiences more rarely under certain circumstances. So we talked about liminal states, where people might, for a moment, be more interconnected and in a psi-conducive state. So it's a recipe. We've also got to think about the other people that are involved. So it's a recipe. It's not just one person. It's distributed perhaps within connected peoples. It's a connected system. So yeah, I think this is all I have to say. It's probably a lot to say in a very short period of time, but I think psychology does have an awful lot to say to parapsychology, and I hope that you've enjoyed my presentation today. So now I'm
Okay, so sadly, Christine is not going to be able to join us for the Q&A, but she did prepare something very interesting for us so that we can enjoy a little bit more interaction. And just give me a moment to pull up a slide. We call this reverse Q&A. And so just a moment here. Hopefully this will work. Okay, so she's given us some prompts that we can discuss among ourselves. And there are 4 discussion tables that have been set up. And I encourage you to choose a question that appeals to you. and then join the table with other attendees that are interested in the same question. And I hope that you have a really, really good conversation. So the first question is, what might be the best ways to healthily increase ESP experiences and encourage better performance on ESP experiments? If that's your topic, you want to go to the table called Increasing ESP. Next question, could meditation or other ways to increase metacognition help us become more focused on information that we are usually filtering out of our attention? If that's your question, please go to the table meditation in ESP. If we are usually filtering psi out of our attention, do you notice more information in your attentional window at certain points in the day and night? Is there an optimal time during the day and night where you can become consciously aware of fleeting information and images? And that will be the table time of day in ESP. And finally, the last question, if psi works like a psychobiosocial system, how might we loosen the boundaries within it? Are there ways to become more socially intertwined or connected, perhaps? And if that is the topic that interests you, go to the social connectedness and ESP table. In general, in the social lounge, we do encourage table hopping. So, feel free to hop around to various conversations, whether it be these four here or conversations that are already in the works from earlier today. We will have a social lounge break until I believe 12:50. Our next talk is going to be Mark Bacuzzi on mediumship. So regardless if you feel like joining the social lounge, do stick around, and our next session will take place in about 25 minutes.